Hello everyone, welcome to our class this week on area studies that will be specifically covering African studies. My name is Kethenji Kenywa. I do research on African politics and society using disciplinary approaches of area-based global studies. Now, if you have questions and comments about this session and the next one, please contact me through Moodle or email. I hope you will have a fruitful time in the following two sessions. Before I dive into Africa, I should emphasize that my approach to this topic is based on the discipline in which I am trained, which is area-based global studies. I went through the introductory lecture by Professor Fukutake, and he explains very well the concept of area and global studies. Actually, he touches on area-based global studies at Sophia, and I happen to have graduated from the Graduate School of Global Studies there. So I am a product of what Professor Fukutake was exploring in his first lecture. In this section, and before we get into Africa, I want us to think very briefly about the relevance of area studies knowledge in a new, more intense phase of globalization. The dramatic shift in the global political landscape of the late 1980s revealed the intellectual and economic vulnerability of area studies establishment. The end of Cold War simultaneously reduced the strategic significance of national and regional boundaries and facilitated the rise of a new discourse of globalization. Now, does globalization, defined as a process of global flows of capital, people, and ideas, offer or accelerate the mission and the need for area studies? I am not sure what your answer to that question is, but I should emphasize that the entanglements of globalization are site and situation specific. To be fully understood, therefore, they require the understanding of cultural and historical context that are provided for by area studies. In this sense, one of the biggest challenges of area studies is facing the pervasive realities of globalization. Historically, area studies has tended to focus on state-centered projects of modernization and development. Area-based global studies calls for grassroots globalization or globalization from below. In this section, we have mentioned area-based global studies referring to global studies that are area conscious, meaning they involve awareness and willingness to cross the dominant conceptual boundaries and bring forth newer conceptualization of the peripheries. The new shift emphasizes a decentered approach that helps us understand the diverse webs of realities in the vast continent of Africa. To understand Africa as a subject for area studies, I will not define the term African studies in the strict sense of the term definition. I will, instead, present to you the complexities of studying Africa. In other words, I submit that to understand African studies begins from understanding the complexities of Africa as an area study. If we grasp this complexity, I am optimistic that we will develop a unique approach to understand African studies. Throughout these two sessions, I want the students to think about these key concepts. 1, what is Africa? 2, who is an African? 3, how is Africa talked about? In other words, what is the nature of the discourse about Africa in the global political arena? And finally, how should Africa be studied and who can study Africa? can an African actually study Africa? If we think through this concept and questions, I think we can conceptualize what actually the nature of African studies is. In such, I would like you to make your own conclusion of what is African studies, guided by these critical questions that may provide you with a specific worldview. I have done this because the question, what is African studies, is again a complex one and must be looked at from the perspectives of the complexities that surround Africa as a subject of area studies. Studying Africa is a mission to understand Africa's distinctive nature, to be able to explain its representation and misrepresentations. In taking such an approach, we are able to understand Africa's contribution to our world today. From the four questions presented here, that is, what is Africa, who is an African, where is Africa, and who and how can we study Africa, I will explain these four approaches in this and in the next session. In all these questions, I posit that to study Africa is to engage Africa in perspectives of its histories, peoples, and culture. Secondly, to study Africa is to engage with the discourses on African realities, or, if you like, everyday livelihoods that are always complex to unpack. The question, what is Africa, provides a basic introduction to Africa. It involves at Africa's perspectives, histories, peoples, and culture. I will not dwell so much on this section, though I believe there is so much we can explore with this question. In asking this question, it is important to have this kind of an exercise. Assuming I give you a plain map like this, look at it carefully and think about if you can fill the names of each of the African countries here. I want you to make a small goal in these 2 sessions to be able to transform the previous map into something like this. It is not too hard. Well, if you cannot name everything, please set a goal to name at least 10 African countries after these 2 sessions. I usually find this map very interesting in helping us have a general view of how big Africa is. And in this map, that you see that Africa can accommodate several continents, several geographies such as USA, China, Europe, India, and Japan, and others. I am not so sure about the accuracy here, but I think it is helpful in making us think about the vastness of this continent. This is the most basic description of Africa by regions. As you can see on this map, Africa can be divided as Northern region, West, Central, East, and Southern Africa. Sometimes, depending on your sources, where a country belongs may also differ. Another, but maybe more complex way of looking at how Africa is divided is by using the borders, critically called arbitrary, that were drawn at Berlin Conference in 1884. At this conference, Africa was designed according to which colonial power would occupy which part of Africa. These borders, though challenged as usually illogical, have been maintained largely as they were drawn to the present. Africa is home to thousands of people groups, especially if you classify them on an ethnic basis. Human geography is a great way to understand Africa. This map shows you classification of human geography using large-scale categories of people groups. In the northern region, you will find Afro-Asiatic people groups that include the Berbers, Arabic, Amharic, and the Oromos. On the western side, in countries like Nigeria and Ghana, you will find the first category of Niger-Congo people groups, which include the Fulani, Yoruba, and the Igbo. Another group of Niger-Congo people groups occupy the vast region of Central and Southern Africa and are made up of the Lingala, the Congo, Chewa, Soto, and Swahili. As I said in the beginning, to understand African studies from an area studies perspective, you need to ask yourself these questions and try to see how you can answer them. Now, let's jump into the second question, which is, who is an African? Please take a look at these pictures and answer the question. Who in these three pictures is an African, in your own opinion? I wonder how you can answer that question. And perhaps some faces are unfamiliar to you, and that might make it a little bit more difficult for you to answer the question. But please keep thinking about the question. From these three pictures, these three images, who is an African? You may have come up with many possible answers, so let's now begin with the first image. The first image belongs to Guy Scott, who became the first white African president in sub-Saharan Africa since apartheid in Zambia between 2014 and 2015, after his boss, President Michel Sata, died while in office. Scott, who is of Scottish descent, assumed office as an interim president. He could not, however, continue in office since the nation's constitution says that candidates' parents must have been born in Zambia, if his were not. Scott was born in 1944 in Livingstone, Northern Rhodesia, which later became Zambia after independence from Britain. Dr. Scott's participation in Zambian politics was inspired by his late father, who was an ally of Zambian nationalists and the founder of anti-colonial government newspapers, including the African Mail, now Zambia's largest Daily Mail. Guy Scott seems to represent an African whose Africanness is clearly denied by the legal and political confines of citizenship. Let us now move on to the second image. Perhaps you all know this guy, Barack Obama. In November 5th, 2008, Kenyans took to the streets to celebrate President-elect Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States. In the Kenyan village of Kogelo, the birthplace of Obama's late father, villagers sang, cheered, and danced in the streets when Obama's victory was announced. Many draped themselves in US flags or waved them in the air. Hundreds of people gathered to celebrate with Obama's Kenyan grandmother and members of his extended family. This win was so big that Kenyan President then, Mwai Kibaki, called Obama's election victory a momentous day, not only in the history of the United States of America, but also for them in Kenya. The victory of Senator Obama is our own victory, said the president. As a country, we are full of pride of his success. He also declared November 6, 2008, a public holiday in honor of Obama's victory. In a sense, Kenyans claimed Obama as their own son, brother, blood, and Kenyan. As you can see from the words of Ogutu on the slide, claiming he is our blood. And a very excited lady who says, our brother, our blood, our Kenyan. Obama, however, cannot legally or politically claim Africanness, but his lineage clearly claims that seems to strongly assert his Africanness. I will not dwell so much on the third picture. It simply is a picture of what many might classify as African and whose contestation is rarely present. Maybe what some may refer to as typical African. These two little ones represent the mosaic identities of what it is to be an African. In answering the question, who is an African, these three cases present to us the multiplicity and variety of identities in Africa. The question of Africanness is an important one to African studies, and also more so to Africans themselves. As we engage in study of Africa, we need to ask how Africa identity is constructed. Does Africa present any challenges to the mosaic identities that people of African ancestry living within within and beyond the continent bear? We also need to take this question further and ask, do all people that have categorized as Africans or having an African pedigree perceive themselves as Africans? Are all who perceive themselves as Africans accepted as such? Are there divergent levels of Africanness? And are some people more African than others? How does an African identity interface with other levels of identity and citizenship in Africa? And what are the implications of the contentious nature of African identity and citizenship for the project of Pan-Africanism and making of African nation and Africa's development trajectories? Let us now think through the complexity of understanding who is an African. I propose a formula for understanding this issue based on the view of an African in their multi-layeredness. The basic implication of this approach is that you cannot exhaustively understand an African by focusing on only one aspect. But even picking one aspect still proves complicated. Due to the constraint of time and space, I will very briefly explore legal political layer. But as you can see, there are other interesting ways of defining Africanness, such as kinship ties, where the Luo people of Kenya claim Obama as their son. There is also a more philosophical attribute that can be employed to assert belonging. Africa has strong shared value systems and worldviews, whose examples are Ubuntu, Arambe in Kenya, and Ujamaa in Tanzania. All these provide a foundation for belonging, and we can explore them to understand that better. The idea of citizenship answers the question, who belongs? Citizenship is belonging to a state, and it comes with rights and obligations. Formal citizenship, formal membership in a state is also a matter of security and identity, with state institutions representing citizens at home and abroad. This notion of citizenship, as understood in the context of modern state, presents special challenges to Africa, whose states are based on what we referred to as before arbitrary borders of 1885. The notion of belonging to a state has changed since the establishment of most independent sovereign states in Africa in the second half of the 20th century. Globalization, digitalization, migration, and international displacement have rendered obsolete the concept of groundedness. The idea that citizens live, work, vote, and earn and spend their money in a home country where they are physically grounded. Citizenship plays a growing role in government at a time when globalization and population mobility have shifted the context of belonging. Hence, as a legal status associated with national identity, citizenship is both negotiated and contested. The often synonymous use of terms nationality and citizenship makes such a dispute apparent. The multiple meanings of citizenship leave individuals vulnerable to social, political, and economic injustices. This vulnerability is further increased by government's insistence on having the sole authority to define belonging, especially for those who do not have the means to challenge such decisions in court. So such examples include Zambia's former president, Kenneth Kaunda, Botswana's opposition politician, John Modise, and the Ivorian former president minister, Alassane Ouattara, of whom all are examples of politicians who have been prevented from running for office by being stripped of their citizenship. It's not just the politicians or individuals who can be denied rights via citizenship status, but also disqualification from citizenship has been used against groups of people. For example, the Ethiopian authorities denied thousands of refugees citizenship after the Eritrean-Ethiopian War of 1998 to 2000, on the grounds that they were allegedly of Eritrean origin and therefore a security risk. Similarly, Zimbabwean state denies citizenships to hundreds of thousands of second and third generation migrants born in Zimbabwe because their parents and their grandparents were originally from Nyasaland, present-day Malawi. Denial of access to rights, entitlements, and civil freedoms becomes a weapon to exclude second, third, and fourth generation migrant descendants. Now, while writing about the idea of sharing, James Ferguson has brought out another way of conceptualizing inclusion beyond the confines of modern understanding of citizenship. He argues that nation-state frame of membership is inadequate. Ferguson proposes that the obligation to share, which never depends only on membership but also what he calls presence, on being here, is a unique lens to open up an understanding of who should be included in an African setting. His work, Presence and Social Obligation, strives to demonstrate that such obligatory sharing based on the presence can be observed in the way that marginalized urban population access state services, however unequally across Africa. He argues that on site where the notion of claiming presence is evidence is one site of claiming presence is in a matatu. And this may offer a foundation for conceptualizing inclusion. We will not explore deeply this topic about matatu, but I will explain the concept of matatu, and then you can try to connect it with the issue of inclusion. Please look at this picture of a matatu on the slide, and also what might the image of inside a matatu. Matatu is a common public transport in Kenya, and you can find similar versions of in other African countries with different names. For example, taxi in Uganda, daladala in Tanzania, and so on and so on. Matatu is accessible to anybody, regardless of class or status. The concept that Ferguson is explaining in a matatu context is when there is no more space to accommodate any more passengers. Now, please remember that a state always tries to regulate number of passengers in a matatu that they can carry, but they have always been difficult to implement. For some reason, many people seem fine with congestion and provide a way of dealing with it right there, either by squeezing a little bit more or creating sitting space where there was none. It seems always that getting rid of someone already in the matatu is unthinkable, and people will always sacrifice their comfort and accommodate whoever is inside. This is the idea that Ferguson is exploring in his work on presence, that whoever is there should be accommodated. If we connect that to belonging, we get a more complex understanding of who should belong. And an idea that seems to use very simple logic, which is whoever is here belongs here. Sort of now bringing the challenge to the idea of citizenship as we understand it within state mechanism. Now, we want to jump to our third question of inquiry: where is Africa? Of course, the easiest way to ponder about this question is to locate Africa geographically. But I want to introduce a somewhat different dimension to that word. Let me take you back a little bit to the approaches of area studies. Area studies was an academic enterprise that took as its basic unit of analysis territories that were often products of European imperialism and contained within their boundaries a bewildering variety of social, economic, and cultural forms. Wedded to European American conceptions of nation state and progress, and the comparative approach in which Western civilization was the normative case, area studies projected the differences within sovereign states and areas they constituted onto boundaries between them. This state-centered approach often reinforced a static view of culture and geography and interrelationship between the two. Therefore, the area studies tended to be viewed as relatively immobile aggregates of traits, with more or less durable historical boundaries and with unity composed of more or less enduring properties. An argument that has been made by Abadrai again. Area studies posited the other as somehow beyond, or usually behind in the development sense. The political, economic, and socio-cultural structures of modernity effectively denied the coexistence of multiple complexities of modernities, including forms of alternative to resistance. From the beginning, area studies was an integral part of the modernist project that sought to remake the world in the image of the West. And it assumed power of nation states to define territories of culture and history. The type of knowledge considered useful was knowledge that generated and applied to one's understanding of processes of modern social change, particularly state building and economic development. And then, therefore, ultimately, all this was viewed through the lenses of American economic, political, and strategic interest in particular parts of the world. So the question then is, how did this view of looking at the world influence the understanding of Africa as a place? That is going to be our next question in the third pillar. As part of the struggle with the project of modernization, many people have approached Africa as a subject of study in different ways. Some prominent approaches analyze Africa in its engagement with the colonizing power of the early 19th century. It does seem that one of the results of such an approach is urging Africa to decolonize and carve out our own unique identity. I want us to think how two scholars I have selected here explain how discourses of Africa in the quest for modernity approach this topic. Therefore, we will examine this subject by taking into account two issues that James Ferguson and Binyavanga Wainaina have raised. please find time to before the next class and familiarize yourself with these two works. Wainaina will help us understand how Africa is framed in the global political discourse in his article called How to Write About Africa. In his part, Ferguson picks on a similar theme and shows us how Africa is often a shadow in global political discourse. But he also brings an interesting aspect of how African himself actually understands his place in the global political order. So I'll see you in the next session, but before that, I want you to go through these two articles because we will use them and refer to them severally in our next class. Thank you very much for your attention.